The rest of the article on Marvin Kipper and Dr. Felicia Morner was redacted. There were no records on the observation hold, no further profile on the psychiatrist or the institution. They were just gone. With a sullen look, Calden closed his father's laptop. He turned his head to the window of the office, which again gave way to the bustling night sky of the great city of Temerden. To the far end, a new tower loomed at least twice as large as those surrounding it, the one that clawed at the heavens, the Grand Central Spire. It was the tower that his mother, Nora Vajor, had dedicated the last 2 years of her life to see constructed. Frustrated, the boy began rummaging through his father's desk, looking for something, anything else. He froze when he heard the door to the office give a soft click. In a swift panic, he ducked underneath the desk and quieted himself to listen as the light from the hallway pooled into the room. There was the soft sound of a person brushing their way silently inside. Calden strained his chest, fighting the urge to breathe deeply. He could hear more rustling from inside the room. Based on the sound of the footsteps, it wasn't his father who had entered. A moment passed in silence, and then another, and Calden wondered if the person had left already. Slowly, he inched himself from under the desk to get a look at the window at the other end. It was dark enough outside that he could see the reflection on the surface, the blurred image of a woman, standing quietly in the center of the office. The glare from the phone in her hand betrayed her features. She had soft dark hair bound behind her head that curled around her glasses in tight loops. Beneath the beads on her neck, she wore a black pedestrian coat over a familiar uniform. She was an agent of the Temerden Defense Agency, and he recognized her. It was Agent Helena Merkel, his father's personal assistant at the TDA. From the reflection on her glasses, he could almost make out the photo of the man she was texting. He strained his eyes to see better, leaning in towards the window in hopes that he might be able to make the person out. Swiftly, however, the light went away and she pocketed her phone. She turned and started walking towards the laptop on the head commissioner's desk when she paused. Her head turned slightly to the window, and a jolt of fear shot through Calden. "Why aren't you still at the party, kid?" Merkel said briskly. Calden exhaled, closing his eyes, as his fear turned into a dull weight in the pit of his chest. He crawled out from underneath the desk and stood, using his father's chair as support. "I guess I'm not in a celebrating mood," Calden said. "What are you doing in your father's office, Calden? You know you shouldn't be in here without permission." "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, walking to the other side of the desk as Merkel approached. She stopped and sighed, resting her hand on the edge. "He was looking for you. He sent me to come and find you so they can take you home, Calden," Agent Merkel said with a tone of exasperation. "I looked everywhere else, but I had a hunch you'd be in here. You want to tell me why?" "I just wanted to find somewhere quiet," Calden said, dropping his eyes to feign innocence. His mind went to the laptop, wondering if he had closed it fully or if it was just slightly out of position. Before he knew it, his eye twitched towards the desk, and Merkel noticed. She walked over to the computer and opened it, spinning it around to face her. She wasn't shocked to see that the lock screen had already been opened and a web page was up on the display, but something odd caught her eye. "This article has security clearance of level 7, Merkel said. "How did you—" "It was already open," Calden replied quickly. Merkel gave him a suspicious look before scrolling up to the title. "Wait a minute. This article is about Ulrich, your adopted brother?" Merkel stood, still looking at the screen, before glancing back at the boy. "I don't understand. Why would the commissioner have something like this on his laptop?" "Read the abstract," Calden said carefully. Merkel hesitated before glancing back at the document and scrolling down the page. She read most of the abstract to herself until she came to a specific passage and read it aloud. "Subject has induced recurrent bouts of hysteria and paranoia in prior caregivers, consequently precipitating violent episodes involving the subject and those in proximity. Following an extended observation period, the subject exhibited atypical signals in the areas of developmental socialization and neuroimaging, with anomalous intervals of general psychosis." Merkel glanced at Calden. "You think Ulrich was responsible for Nora's death? Calden, that's ridiculous." "It was also my brother, Ethan," Calden clarified. Merkel sighed. "I know, and I'm sorry. It was a terrible accident, and I get it. The world can feel cruel sometimes. It can be easy to look for something to blame." She glanced at the article. "Or someone." "You were with my father when it happened." Merkel hesitated before closing the laptop. "You know that I work closely with him. You can't blame him for what happened either. He's head commissioner of the TDA. He's very busy." "I know that. Calden said, straining to keep the strength in his voice, and I know who you are. You joined my father's sector only weeks after the start of the Grand Central Spire project, while my mother was away. Ever since then, my father has been busier than usual. Merkel stopped, glaring at the boy. The light of the city spayed out along the floor and ceiling. The implication hung in the air between them. Are you sleeping with my father? Calden said at last. Merkel took a deep breath before taking a step back from the laptop. Casually, she walked around the front of the desk, running her finger along it. Calden drew back slowly as his eyes met hers. You're in that TDA internship program, is that right? It must be stressful for you, your first week, especially with what happened. You start seeing ghosts everywhere. You get distracted. It's easy to become paranoid working here, believe me. I'm not paranoid, Calden said, watching her intently. Merkel stopped at the center of the desk, directly opposite to him, and her eyes softened. With a gentle voice, she said, I'm not sleeping with your father, Calden. Calden studied her eyes, seeing a twinkle of concern in her expression. He saw the chance to release his tension. With a subtle exhale, an adolescent gaze to the side, he huffed, giving the impression that he believed her. Merkel seemed to buy it. Her shoulders lowered, and she glanced at the computer again, her brow furrowed in mild contemplation. I think maybe your father is just as desperate as you are to find the truth. This is exactly why we have a policy at the TDA. No personal investigations. Falling down that rabbit hole is the fastest way to lose yourself. And Calden, if you're ever going to make it through the program, then you're going to need to learn to discern the ghosts from the skeletons. Are you going to tell my father about this? Calden asked. Merkel pondered that for a moment. As long as you don't make a habit out of sneaking into restricted places, I'll let this one slide. Now come on, let's head back to the party. She held out a gloved hand. Calden nodded, taking a cautious step closer to her when a peculiar thought hit him. He studied her outreached hand and then looked up at her. My father had you look into Yllisius, didn't he? Merkel remained quiet, staring softly at Calden. I can help you, Calden urged. The records of Yllisius' 48-hour psychiatric hold were lost. If my father did assign you, then I know you can't talk to him directly. I live with him. I can ask him what happened. Merkel smiled lightly, the red tan of her lipstick becoming more apparent, brightened by the city lights. She shook her head. Come on, kid, it's late. Calden held his gaze a while longer before sighing. He went around the desk, avoiding her hand, and walked the rest of the way on his own. He gave one last look, an accusing eye on the woman in the office, before he left through the doorway. Merkel stood back for a few moments after the door had closed, and shot a side glance at the computer left on the desk. Shaking her head, she took the phone from her pocket and made a call. Calden returned home with his father that night, the ride tense with a quiet air between them as they entered the Roslyn district, a wealthy region of aristocrats and high-ranking officials where they resided. Upon arriving, Ian stopped the car just outside the garage and peered up at their home. Calden followed his father's gaze to a window which reflected a dim light. He figured that Yllisius was reading at his desk, as he often would. His eyes drifted down to his father. Your mother was fond of him, Ian spoke lowly, still staring out the window. Yes, Calden replied quietly. The boy hardly said 2 words to her. She never once minded. His father continued. Calden was quiet as he watched, until Ian turned to him, noticing the curious expression on the boy's face. He turned the key to the car, starting the engine. Pay it no mind, child. What are you doing? Calden asked as the cruiser lights ignited. I only came to drop you off. I need to return to the office for the night. You will stay here and care for your brother. Calden studied his father, suddenly imagining the red lipstick shining across Agent Merkel's smile back in the office, the same lipstick that would be waiting for his father when he returned. With an angry huff, the boy got out of his father's car and slammed the door shut. After a brief moment, Ian pulled away. Calden watched as the car moved quietly down the road, in and out of the lanterns of the street, until it was gone. Standing there, without a word in his mind, he watched the empty road. Then, without looking back, he turned and made his way up the pathway to the front door. It was dark inside, save for a slice of light spilling out of a door on the second floor. Yllisius' door. Calden removed the coat he had taken to the party and hung it up on the rack. Then his eye went to the room again, compelled by a soft anger, an adolescent indignation that refused to be left in the dark any longer. He moved across the hall and to the stairs, approaching the sliver of light. As Calden went to the door, he realized it was cracked. Without knocking, he pushed it open and peeked inside. Yllisius? The room was empty, save for the warm glow of the lamp near the window. A chill went down Calden's back as he realized Yllisius was somewhere else in the house, hiding in the dark. Trying to push the thought from his mind, he moved inside, his eyes carefully scanning. Yllisius' room was in pristine condition. Rows of books lined the bookcases against the wall, all neatly arranged. The bed was immaculate, as if no one had ever slept in it, and there wasn't a thing out of place save for an open notebook on the desk near the window. Odd room for an adolescent boy, Calden commented, ignoring the fact that he was younger than Yllisius. Quietly, he approached the table and got a look at the notebook laying just under the light. He opened it, running his eyes swiftly along the markings on the pages, and his heart skipped a beat. The markings were nearly indecipherable. Calden turned another page. In a few places he recognized certain patterns, what could be considered equations, but the writings overlapped. It was difficult to discern a single line of thought, just jumbled symbols with barely a space between them. As he turned the pages, he wondered if they were just scribblings of what Yllisius was reading in his books, layered over one another, or if it was something more, some sort of encoding. Then he heard a noise from downstairs, and his uneasy feeling turned to fear. Moving quickly, Calden took out his phone and snapped a few pictures of the writing. When he was done, he returned the notebook back to its position and rushed out of the room, closing the door just enough so that it was left as he found it. He searched the area, studying the shadows of the hallway, the corner leading to the rooms in the back, scared that he might be watching. He glimpsed the doors on the second floor before turning his attention downstairs. It was dark. Cautiously, Calden made his way down to the first level and stopped when he noticed a break in the moonlight flooding in from the dining room, a shadow that formed the shape of a person. He turned through the entryway to see Yllisius sitting on top of the table, his legs crossed. For a moment, Calden thought that Yllisius was facing him, watching quietly. Then he realized that Yllisius was facing the window. Taking a small breath, Calden made his way around the table until he could see the side of his brother's face. Yllisius was staring outside, through to a forest billowing in the windy night. "What are you doing?" Calden asked, his voice revealing more of his nerves than he intended. Yllisius didn't respond. In fact, he didn't even look over. It was expected. Calden had never heard the boy speak, and the two had barely exchanged a single glance before that night. This time was no different. The boy just sat there, staring, as if not part of the same realm. Usually, the fact that Yllisius didn't speak didn't bother Calden much. He almost admired it, but as the question behind his brother's past began to plague him, he felt that the silence was more of an insult than a peculiarity. "You know," Calden started, biting his tongue from the indignation surfacing. "When you first came here, Ethan and I were told that you were going to be our older brother, that you would be part of our family. Maybe I didn't realize it at the time, but I guess I was excited. I thought we would have a relationship, that we would be friends." Yllisius didn't budge, and Calden looked away, following his brother's gaze to the trees outside. "Then I met you. It was like you were somewhere else, like you didn't belong here, or anywhere, like you didn't fit in with the world. They said you're autistic, but you're not, are you?" Calden looked at him, his eyes burning as Yllisius just sat there. "Tell me the truth. It's not that you can't speak. You just don't want to." A thunderclap from somewhere far away, and in the blackness of the room, that chill started to creep up Calden's spine again. He watched Yllisius for a sign of a reaction, and when none came, he sighed, shaking his head. "They loved you, but you barely even smiled at them. You never said a word, and now they're gone. Do you even care?" Yllisius shifted slightly, as if adjusting to become more comfortable. But Calden still felt that he was listening, despite how hard the boy tried to hide it. Almost to himself, Calden then said, "That's why my father was reading the article, wasn't it? He blames you. He thinks that somehow you're responsible." Calden moved around the table to stand in front of Yllisius. As the two faced each other, For the first time, their gazes met. Are you responsible, brother? Yllisius' expression changed, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, it seemed there was something at the edge of his lips, some sort of response. But a moment passed, and then another, and the boy only stared. Why won't you answer me? Calden said quietly. Through his lessons, he had learned to read facial expressions, slight movements in the eyes, twitches of the mouth and nose. The art was akin to reading the mind. As Calden studied him, though, searching the boy's pupils, face, nose, mouth, he could only see one thing: hatred. Did you kill them? A loud crash shook the house, and Calden threw himself to the side, hitting one of the china cabinets full of dishes just by the window. The china rang loudly as he slammed into it, his mother's plates and fixtures raining down all around him. As the chaos settled, Calden gazed back. Yllisius hadn't moved. The crash had come from the lightning nearby, closer than before, and his nerves had gotten the better of him. Struggling to regain himself, he looked at his hand and saw blood. Yllisius sat studying him quietly, unmoving from his perch. Holding his hand, Calden stood up and backed away towards the kitchen. As he entered, he turned on the faucet and ran water over his palm, taking a moment to calm his nerves. Discerning the ghosts from the skeletons, Calden reminded himself, closing his eyes. He began to feel foolish for his reaction, for letting his irrational fear take hold of him. As he wrapped his hand in a bandage, he sighed, turning back towards the dining room. Listen, Yllisius, I'm sorry, Calden said as he re-entered. He turned on the light, about to say something more, when he stopped. Looking left and right, he realized he was alone in the room. Yllisius was gone.